welcome back to Westminster, where, of course, Boris Johnson lost his working majority, his first vote in the Commons, and potentially control of the entire Brexit process yesterday. Another busy day ahead today. I'm joined by our reality check correspondent, Chris Morris, who's here to answer your questions, and also senior researcher at the Institute for Government, Maddy Thimont Jack. We will get to those questions in just a moment, but Chris, first of all, before that, talk to us about where we are at with this process.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're counting down to the deadline of October the 31st, because that's when, as the law currently stands, and if nothing changes, that's when we'll leave the EU with or without a deal. So we know the Rebel Alliance, including 21 Conservative MPs from last night, are determined to stop that. And that's what's going to be happening today. There'll be a vote to block no deal by forcing the Prime Minister to ask the EU for a 3-month Brexit extension until January the 31st next year. So the first question to be answered in a vote later this evening, will it pass or will it fail? If it fails, unlikely given there was a majority last night to hold today's debate, but if it does, well, the government keeps control of the Brexit process and the Prime Minister will look to fulfil his promise to leave at the end of October. He says he wants a deal, but he's prepared to leave without one. Would the opposition have any other way of stopping him? They could call a vote of no confidence, but if they can't pass this legislation today, would they really be able to win that vote? If they did, we could be heading for an election, but time would be really tight. Now, if today's vote passes, will the government accept it or reject the path that the opposition and Tory rebels have forced upon them? If the government accepts it, Boris Johnson would have to do something he has promised not to do, request another delay to Brexit. If the European Council, the other 27 leaders, agree, that would mean the Article 50 Brexit negotiating period would be extended until the end of January, or possibly even later. If the EU offers a later date, today's bill would essentially force the Prime Minister to accept it unless it is specifically rejected within 2 days by MPs in the House of Commons. If the EU refuses to offer any extension, unlikely, but you never know, well, the default position still stands. So we're heading for Brexit at the end of next month, deal or no deal. And what if the government essentially refuses, says it can't accept Parliament's instruction? Well, the Prime Minister has already said that they will seek to hold a general election. Now, for that to happen would require the support of 2/3 of MPs in the Commons. If the government gets that support, the election is expected to be held on around October the 14th, maybe a day or two later. If MPs reject that snap election, though, the government has said it will follow the law. But what if it tries to wiggle out of that and delay this new legislation blocking a no-deal Brexit? There would almost certainly be legal challenges. Don't forget, Parliament's due to be suspended from next week for 5 weeks, so the role MPs play could be limited. Will some kind of negotiations continue in Brussels and elsewhere looking for a compromise Brexit deal? Maybe. Or does the election that everyone is talking about become inevitable? And that, Anita, seems to be where we're heading. If the opposition can nail this legislation down and be convinced that no deal has been ruled out for now, a general election feels like it's pretty much an inevitability sooner rather than later.
OK, very interesting to take us through all of that, Chris. Thank you for that. And let's get on to those questions that you, our viewers, have been sending in. Maddy, I'll begin with you to bring you in. Just a reminder, this is Maddy Thimont Jack, senior researcher at the Institute for Government, joining Chris to answer your questions. John asks, what do the terms remove whip and deselect mean? And what is the result? That's a good question, actually, just to get back to basics.
Yeah, so I think to start with is the whips are the members of the government who ensure that MPs, well, I mean, you also have whips in opposition parties, sorry. So the whips are the members of the party who make sure MPs all vote the way that the party wants them to vote. So if you remove the whips, that means they're no longer sort of compelled to vote with the party. And essentially what it means is they're no longer Conservative MPs. And that's what they did last night, is they said that they're going to remove the whip from the 21 Conservative MPs who voted against the government. In terms of the deselection, that really relates to a general election. So that would be saying that actually these MPs could not stand again as Conservative members in their constituencies. So there's a bit of a question mark about quite the extent to which the government can control selection. I think there's a bit of a question mark about the Conservative Party constitution, but that's what they've said, is that these MPs won't be able to do that.
Because some of the constituencies have already said they want to support the MPs who've had the whip removed from them, like
Philip
Hammond,
Hammond, yeah, that's exactly
being a
the
case in
example.
point. An anonymous question which asks, why can't the Remainers form a national unity interim government for the purpose of settling the Brexit issue? Chris, do you want to tackle that one?
In theory, they could if they could prove they have a majority in the House of Commons. If they had a vote of no confidence in this Prime Minister and he lost it and he was forced to resign, and then they could prove they would have a majority, they could do that. But of course, it's A, about numbers, and it's B, about politics. We saw Jeremy Corbyn suggesting a few weeks ago, well, let's have a vote of no confidence and I'll lead this interim government to sort Brexit out. Well, if you're the Liberal Democrats or others, maybe you don't want to sit in a government, even for a short period, under Jeremy Corbyn. So there's a lot of politics involved in it. In theory, it can happen, but of course, it's not just about Brexit. It's also about manoeuvring for this election, which we think is coming sooner rather than later.
Yes, lots of manoeuvring. That's a key word. A related question, Maddy, for you. Again, this one is anonymous. With no working majority, therefore no longer an effective government, why can't the opposition ask the Queen to form a government?
I think it sort of comes down to sort of what Chris has just said. I mean, the way that our process works is that you don't need to have a sort of formal vote of confidence to prove you have the confidence of the House of Commons. You sort of have it until you don't. So if MPs want to say that actually they no longer have the confidence of the government, then they can table a formal vote of no confidence, or they could, in theory, table a vote saying we no longer have the confidence of this government, but we do have the confidence of someone else, which then might put pressure on the Prime Minister to resign and potentially recommend an alternative Prime Minister to the Queen. But we don't quite, it just doesn't seem at this stage there are the numbers for that. And as I say, until the House actually pushes the government to that point, then they will stay on as the government.
And Chris, John asks, what sequence would happen if the government, and just picking up on what Maddy was saying, what sequence would happen if the government, Prime Minister, simply resigned, went to the Queen and resigned, no votes involved?
Well, if he doesn't think he has the support of the House of Commons anymore, can't prove majority, he could in theory do that, then we would have this period in which you would have to see whether anyone else could form a government. I mean, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act has changed things in the last few years. It kind of prescribes the way things are going. But it would be another route eventually, you would imagine, to get to an election. But of course, this discussion about how you get to an election is all being held in the context, as we were saying earlier, of this looming deadline of the end of October, where the law currently stands, we would leave the EU deal or no deal. And that really is dominating every other thoughts when people come to political tactics, I think.
Another question, this time on the House of Lords, Maddy. Perhaps you'd like to have a look at this one. Will the unelected House of Lords be able to filibuster, in other words, talk out the proposed legislation to delay Brexit? No one putting their name to that question, but it's a good one.
Yeah, so that was actually what we're going to be looking at today. So what the House of Lords today are trying to do is pass a motion that will be able to manage the bill's passage through the House of Lords sort of much more quickly on Thursday and Friday later this week, which normally they can't do. But what government peers are trying to do is actually try and talk out that motion today. So the business motion has, I think, 86 amendments have been tabled from government peers, and in the Lords you can't just select amendments that you want to talk about. If a peer wants to talk about his amendments, he can.
And that's a lot of voting.
It's a lot of voting, and so each time, if you want to get through those 86, you've got to vote firstly about whether you should vote, and then vote. And that, if you think about 40 minutes of that process for each amendment, you're looking at a lot of
how
hours.
many did you say?
86.
Times 86.
Yeah.
It's why, if you're a member of the House of Lords at the moment, you may want to invest in a sleeping bag. I mean, let's see how things go over the next few days. But it's a different process than the House of Commons.
I think we heard Norman say that some peers are determined to, sit over the weekend if necessary to make sure that they get through all of this business. Sergey asks, can the Prime Minister ignore or not comply with the law to avoid no deal? If he can or will, what's going to happen next?
So I suppose the question is if this legislation passes today. I mean, the government's been pretty clear. We will follow the law. We will uphold the law. But Boris Johnson has been equally clear that I will never be a Prime Minister that accepts an extension to the Brexit process. Again,
so
the logical
you have this
conclusion
enormous
is reaching an
clash.
election. I mean, there's been speculation about could you try and delay royal assent, or could the Prime Minister and the government simply ignore the law? I don't think so. And we heard, I think, from Jacob Rees-Mogg and from others in the debate last night, we will uphold the law.
Maddy, do you want to come in on that?
Well, no, I was just going to agree that I think that the government has made it very clear that they will follow the law. And, I mean, obviously they're plan is to see if they can try and hold an election to mean that they won't be in a position where they do need to follow that law when we get to that point. But given that the bite in the law is on the 19th of October, there's very little time for them to do anything ahead of that apart from follow the law if it gets royal assent.
A question now from Simon Roper, who asks, what, following the upcoming general election, whenever that is, prevents a future winning Conservative government or coalition from repealing any no-deal Brexit legislation?
Nothing, I think, is the short answer. I mean, if this legislation goes through today and it becomes the law of the land, if then Boris Johnson were to win a pretty clear majority, he could repeal it. Or, in fact, if you look at the detail of the legislation, it does say, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but it suggests that if there's a majority in the House of Commons for no deal, then it could proceed in that direction. So, again, the election is key. If he can come back with a better mandate and a proper majority, or a majority in the House of Commons, then yes, he could change course.
Maddy, on
yeah,
that
I mean, I agree with that, and I think, as you say, the law does say if they approve no deal, then they can go for no deal. Yeah. And also, you know, he also, if the EU offer an alternative extension, they can also reject that extension, as you said earlier. I think the other thing to flag is kind of what I was just saying. The timing is quite a problem, though, because the election, I think now the government's saying maybe the 15th of October is their preferred date for an election. Given the law bites on the 19th, you've actually got to get Parliament back up and running to be able to try and repeal the legislation. So that might end up being the biggest problem for them, particularly if MPs don't support the early election motion tonight. It will push back when an election can take place, and that might make it more challenging.
Whatever scenario unfolds, it's incredibly squeezed, isn't it, from a time perspective? We have a question here from Mike, who says the majority of MPs are against no deal, but what are they in favour of? What do they want? And is there any chance of the EU agreeing to it? Well, we just heard, just to come in on Mike's point there, we just heard from the EU a short while ago from the Commission saying, you know, the backstop is the only solution they have at the moment to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and there doesn't seem to be an alternative yet that the EU will accept from the UK.
No, and if we cast our minds back to earlier in the year, before the March the 29th deadline, there were the series of what were called indicative votes, trying to establish whether there was a majority for anything in the House of Commons, and the answer appeared to be, at that stage, there wasn't really. We know what the House of Commons is against. There's a clear majority in the House of Commons against leaving with no deal. But there didn't appear, certainly a few months ago, to be a majority in favour of a particular way forward, which, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, suggests that an election to give somebody a clearer mandate may be the only way forward. I think the danger, of course, is that an election could well produce another hung parliament.
It's all about, Maddy, the numbers, isn't it?
Yeah.
Getting enough people coalescing around one particular option. I know we spoke to Melanie On earlier, who is one of a number of Labour MPs who are trying to get an amendment heard today, which would bring back, if you like, the kernel of Theresa May's deal.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think I completely agree with Chris. I mean, we saw the indicative votes earlier this year and we just couldn't get a majority for anything. I think that's what's really interesting in terms of looking at who voted yesterday, because you actually have this very strange coalition working together at this point to agree an extension. You've got people who actually want Brexit, they just don't want no deal. You've got people who want a second referendum, you want people who want no Brexit at all, and some who are very willing to support, you know, Theresa May's deal if it comes back again. So although they might be able to at this point get a majority in favour of asking for an extension, but actually trying to find a majority for anything else just seems really, really difficult. And I mean, Labour MPs have said they're going to try and amend this bill to say they want essentially another vote on Theresa May's deal. I don't know if they're going to even have a majority to be able to do that at this stage. I mean, it's just, I think we have to wait and see really what happens.
It's probably going to be another very compelling evening in Parliament, watching what happens. Maddy Thimont Jack from the Institute for Government and our own Chris Morris, Reality Check correspondent. Thank you both very much indeed for answering our viewers' questions.